Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here for our third session in our Policing in America lecture series this year. It is a year-long series. We've already had two wonderful and provocative sessions, and we are looking forward very much to this extraordinary panel that we have been fortunate to amass for you today. We'd like to start, of course, by thanking our Dean, Dean John Manning, and the Harvard Law School staff who make this series possible. A very special thanks and gratitude to Jenna Cowie, who is the person behind the machinery that makes all of these logistics work and make this series possible. So our gratitude to Jenna. This webinar today is about policing, it's about race, it's about police unions, and it's about politics. It is interdisciplinary and it is multi-institutional. And at the end of the day, in my view, that is the only way that we can fully and robustly understand the workings of the American criminal system. Criminal law and the criminal process do not exist in a vacuum, separate from politics, separate from our socioeconomic institutions. We cannot understand our criminal system without thinking very specifically about actual police practices, what happens on the ground, which means we need to think about policing as a social and political institution, not only a legal one. We need to think about policing as a profession, and thus we need to think about police unions. To my mind, this is in many ways where the rubber hits the road, as it were, because police unions so powerfully shape how their members are permitted and encouraged to do their jobs, to use force, and historically have protected their members against many of the consequences of using that force disproportionately and excessively against Black people. The title of this webinar is Police Unions and Politics. In this election just last week, we saw police reforms enacted in numerous jurisdictions across the country, including restrictions on the use of force, many new decisions about police funding and the power of police. Police unions opposed many of those reforms, but they passed nonetheless. And so we are in a time of change, of great change and rethinking, in which changes and reforms that seemed unimaginable just a few years ago are now central to the national political discussion. We have a truly extraordinary panel of experts today. Thank you so much to each one of you for taking time out of your schedules. To call them busy schedules is a vast understatement. We know that you have no time. So thank you for sharing that precious resource with us. We're very grateful. We will hear opening remarks from our panel. They will share some of their insights with us. We will have some dialogue and conversation amongst the panel and Professor Crespo and I as moderators. We will ask some questions. If you have a question that you would like to share, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom panel. And I will now turn it over to my colleague and co-moderator, Professor Crespo.
Thank you so much, Professor Natapoff. Thank you to our incredible panel, and thank you to everyone who's here joining us. It is really a privilege to introduce the speakers that we have with us here today. I'm going to tell you a bit about them in the order that they're going to share their opening remarks, and then I'll pose some questions to all of them, sort of a set of questions that's for all four, really to just frame some of the discussion that we're going to have today about police unions and the power that they hold over policing and over our politics of criminal justice. First, it is my real pleasure to introduce DeRay McKesson. DeRay is an activist, he is an organizer, he is a leader in the effort to combat systemic racism in the American penal system and in our policing. A former educator with Teach for America, DeRay became, I think, a household name in reform and activism circles in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown, when you could see his soon to become iconic blue vest on the streets of Ferguson, leading protests night after night, day after day. to my mind, when I think of DeRay, I also think of the equally iconic photograph of his arrest. I think maybe a point to note that within the past week, he did something rather rare in our current times, which is to prevail in a 7-1 vote at the US Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court overturned a judgment against him when he was sued by a police officer who had been who had sued him over an assault that arose out of that, and the Supreme Court reversed in DeRay's favor. Mr. McKesson has captured the attention of millions in appearances from The Daily Show to The Colbert Report to New York Times profiles. He's the host of a podcast, Pod Save the People. He is the co-founder of Campaign Zero, which aims to end police violence in America. And as I sort of know from both scholars who interact with him and from interactions with him myself, is deeply thoughtful and data-oriented about this. Someone who will, call up a law professor and say, "I read your article. How does that interact with, what we're trying to do to get some real change on the ground here?" One of the major campaigns that Campaign Zero is doing right now is called Nix the Six. The tagline of the campaign is that police unions have too much power and it's time to hold them accountable. It lays out 6 specific proposals to do that. Thank you so much, DeRay, for being here and for making the time. Professor Will Jones is a professor of the 20th century American history at the University of Minnesota, with particular interest and expertise in the relationship between race and class, in labor and union organizing, and in the civil rights movement. He's the author of 2 books, The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights, and The Tribe of Black Ulysses, African-American lumber workers in the Jim Crow South. An expert in both contemporary labor organizing and power, and the labor movement and the history of the labor movement and its intersection with questions of race and class and power. He is also, as of a few months ago, the director of a project here at Harvard University, spearheaded by the Labor and Work-Life Program, that is a project on police unions and police violence. And he's coordinating and directing an interdisciplinary effort with multiple scholars and policymakers and experts in this area to try to tackle some of the questions of police union power. Professor Catherine Fisk is the Barba Natrib Armstrong Professor of Law at Berkeley Law School and a leading expert in American labor law and history. She's the author of numerous articles and 5 books, including an award-winning project that's been celebrated by the American Historical Association and the American Society for Legal History. Within her broad-ranging expertise on labor law and the labor movement writ large, she is also an expert on police unions as a component of labor law and of public sector labor power in the United States. I'm thinking in particular of her 2017 article titled Police Unions, and as of just a few months ago, a co-authored essay that she published online with the California Law Review, Reforming Law Enforcement Labor Relations. Thank you so much, Professor Fisk, for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. RaShall Brackney, who is the Chief of Police in Charlottesville, Virginia. She started as Chief of Police there in June of 2018, hired on the heels of the infamous Unite the Right rally, and in response to criticism of the way that the police handled that rally in Charlottesville. She's a 30-year veteran of the Pittsburgh Police Department. Prior to being the Chief of Police in Charlottesville, she was the Chief of Police at George Washington University. In addition to her extensive experience as both a line officer and running 2 different police departments, she holds a master's degree from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD in instructional management and leadership from Robert Morris University. Dr. Brackney, thank you so much for joining us. To all 4 of you, a set of questions to just sort of frame this discussion. In what ways, if any, do you see police unions as part of the systemic problem when it comes to policing in America? Is there a positive side here, or is it all a downside story? How should we think about police unions and the efforts to alter their power or their nature, both with respect to what that means for broader questions of police accountability and these sort of, all of the things that have prompted now 5 years of protest over policing. But then on the other hand, how should we think about efforts to curtail police union power in the context of labor power and of public sector unions more generally? Finally, what are the ways in which the power of police unions should be limited or changed? And what are the major impediments, legal and otherwise, to actually getting such changes to happen? I'll turn it over first to you, DeRay.
Well, it is an honor to be here. I'm assuming that if you got here, you know something about police unions. So I won't do like a 101, but I will say that the police unions sort of sit outside of the world of unions as we think about it. We manage the only database of police union contracts in the United States. It is now called Nexus 6. We have about 700. We are working to get as close to 18,000 as possible. So not every state can do collective bargaining. Not every police department can, not every sheriff's department can. So we're going from 700 to 1,000, then 1,500, then 2,000. So we're working to build it out for people. And I'll show you that in a second, but we've learned a lot over the years. The first success story was in Austin. So in Austin, we work with the organizers who lived in Austin to get the city council to unanimously vote against the police union contract. And it was incredible. When we went into the room, we thought that we had 5 votes. We didn't know that we had all of the votes, which is great. And since then, we've been working in Portland and a host of other places now, either on the contract or on the state Officer Bill of Rights. So there are 21 states that have Officer Bill of Rights. We really only talk about 20 of them because Wisconsin has one, but the Wisconsin Officer Bill of Rights is sort of like a boilerplate labor. There's nothing in it that is of note. There are other things in Wisconsin that are a real problem, but like the Officer Bill of Rights is not necessarily one of them. So we work in those states too. So like Nevada, we're doing some stuff in Maryland. There's some interesting things that might happen in Arizona and Kentucky. We're trying to work in to do some things to repeal the Officer Bill of Rights. Now, in terms of sort of 3 big things that I'll offer that are interesting, when we are in places, what the police will say is, remember, this is not the criminal trial. They're like, you know what? Something really bad happened, and like, don't put all your eggs in that contract. The contract's only about administrative things. It has nothing to do with crimes. As a way to say that like this isn't the place to fight. Now, what we remind people all the time is like they are correct that the contract rarely has things to do with criminal cases. There are cities across the country. There's a city where their contract says that if the officer is found guilty of a misdemeanor, then they can stay on for 60 days. And you're like, that's a weird thing to negotiate. Like, why did the city ever agree to that? So there's some weird things like that. But for the most part, the contracts don't really deal with crime. But when we look at the data around convictions, and here it is, there is Phil Stinson keeps the other database of this data, and Phil is amazing. If you've ever seen Phil's data, we keep it a different way. We keep it by the year of killing. He does it by the year of charge or conviction. The numbers are the same though. Is that when you look at it, look at 2014. 2014 is the highest year of convictions ever. The police kill 1,100 people a year. So when the police tell us like put all our eggs in the criminal, they're like, you're focusing too much on the administrative. If something bad happened, they'll just get dealt with in the criminal process. We're like, the data shows us that that's not true. That like the criminal process actually is not a lever. So when we look at what the most readily available lever is, we do think about the administrative process as one that could be available. The second is that we see people say a lot of things, and this is actually what happened in Louisville. So Louisville, we were trying to get the police union contract voted against, and what the police did really, they won this argument, is that they were like, don't do this because it's really the state law. And what we find across the country is so few people know about the contract. The council people don't know about it. The press can't really write about it because they don't really know. So the only experts in the room are the police. Like, they know it, they get it. They have done it for 40 years. They have been at every negotiation. They grew up with it. And they will say anything, and the police and the departments just sort of believe them. Like the cities believe them, the mayors believe them, the council people believe them. So much of what we do is like help people understand like what is true and what's not true. I'd say that is almost all of our work, is saying like, here is what the contract says. Here is the section of the contract that says it. This is bad. And it is that sort of perfunctory. So Nexus 6, when you can go to a state like Kentucky and you can click and it'll show you exactly what the language is. It'll show you the clauses. And the reason why we don't really paraphrase it here is that when we first started doing this work in 2015, people would say to us, well, it doesn't really say that. You're just being dramatic because you're an activist. And we're like, no, it does really say that. And that is sort of wild, right? So we make all of these things public for people so they can see, because we've seen that be really powerful. In a lot of places, people are shocked. People are like, wow, I didn't know that it really said that. And you're like, yeah, we thought it was sort of nuts too. And that actually that has been helpful. We make these one pagers for people too, so that they can have something that they can send. So this is the Louisville one where we sort of note like what's the thing on the left, and then we explain it on the right so people can just have something to like take. We find that contract language, people feel like they're not smart enough to deal with contracts. Like that's something that we get across the board, whether it's the council people or organizers. So we try and just make it simple for people so they can fight. And the third thing I'd say is like, what are solutions, right? So we've done a good job, all of us, of convincing people this is bad. So what do we do about it? So there are a host of solutions. So one is like to get organizers put on the negotiating team. Austin, we were able to do that. That was interesting. DC passed a law in June that removes bargaining of discipline from the union. That got challenged in court, and the city won. So that is a strategy we've not seen happen in a lot of places. DC is really the only place, but that's actually a really interesting strategy. The third would be to have the council make priorities before negotiations start, so that they're not always coming in on the back end, but sort of affirmatively saying to the mayor. And the fourth thing that we've seen, in Portland did this, we work with Portland to do this, is that the city and the union often have the city and the union often have a cozy relationship. So the person negotiating against the police is normally like a police person. They are representing the city's interest as the government, not the public's interest, which is something we find. So in Portland, what they did is that the council essentially fired the city attorneys as the lead negotiators, and they hired an outside firm. And it's great because they aren't invested in just like keeping the city safe. They're invested in keeping the public safe. And it was a huge battle. And, they were like, this law firm's anti-labor and da-da-da. But we finally got it through because the city was just too cozy. And the thing that helped us in Portland is that the head of HR, she resigned. And then like the next day she went to go work for the police union. And everybody was like, that probably doesn't make sense. And that was actually like the best thing for us because it made the case really well that like, this is actually just too cozy. So when we work with cities across the country, that's what we work with them on, is helping them understand what is possible.
Thank you so much. Professor Jones.
Hello, thanks for including me in this panel, and I'm really happy to be here and look forward to the discussion. I want to just lay out a few questions about, or sort of respond to Professor Crespo's questions. I think it's clear in a number of ways that police unions stood as barriers to reform. They pushed for laws that limit investigations and the discipline of officers accused of misconduct. They restrict civilian oversight of police departments and law enforcement policies. They've negotiated collective bargaining agreements that allow officers to review evidence before testifying about incidents involving police violence and abuse, to remove complaints from their discipline records and to subject complaints to often impossible standards of review and appeal. Most strikingly, I think police have really staunchly defended officers involved in the most egregious cases of abuse and murder, often captured on video in broad daylight, while disparaging victims of police killings, including children and unarmed men and women, as violent criminals, and those who protest as terrorists. So I think there's clearly, a problem with police unions that we need to confront. But I think these behaviors in this record is particularly alarming for those of us who recognized organized labor as the most reliable and effective voice for working people and an essential force in struggles for a more just and equitable economy and society. Unions are particularly important for Black, Brown, and Indigenous working class communities that have borne the brunt of police violence. And their political power has been essential for the creation and strengthening of social welfare and civil rights policies, and for the election of officials who represent the racial, ethnic, and economic diversity of our country. Collective bargaining has been a vital tool for the economic and political empowerment of working class communities, enabling fast food and retail workers to raise the minimum wage, teachers to win more funding for their classrooms, and healthcare workers to negotiate protective equipment and staffing ratios to improve care for patients during the recent pandemic. So I think this is a sort of paradox that I think we need to really hold sort of equal attention to. The role that police unions have played and the importance of collective bargaining, I think, particularly in the public sector. This points to the importance of protecting the collective bargaining rights of all workers, including police, while holding police accountable for racist murder and abuse. And I think that balancing act becomes particularly difficult and important as we approach the inauguration of a new president and the installing of a new Congress. I think this requires a clear understanding of collective bargaining and its impact on accountability and discipline of police officers, and the relative influence of police unions, lawmakers, and the broader public on protections provided by the collective bargaining process. I think it's also key to understand the broader history of policing and of police unions and how they have shaped the institutions of police departments and unions over time. I'm part of a team of scholars, some of who, and activists, including Catherine and DeRay, who have been convened by the Labor and Work-Life Center here at Harvard Law School and the organization Community Change to offer a set of reforms that can increase accountability for police without undermining the collective bargaining rights of all workers. I think a couple of things that are really key to keep in mind as we do that. One is to understand the political nature of collective bargaining. Union contracts are not imposed unilaterally by unions, but in fact result from negotiations between workers and employers. In the case of police contracts, the singular focus on the power of unions overlooks the responsibility of officials to reject positions they deem inconsistent with the interests of the voters they represent. And DeRay has already touched on how this becomes very complicated. Public officials have often favored limits on police accountability because they ran for office on tough on crime platforms, or because such measures are often less costly than increased wages or benefits. They have never been forced to accept them by an over-empowered police union. And this is why similar limits are often imposed by police officers' bills of rights, which are adopted solely at the discretion of legislators in states where unions often have little influence or collective bargaining rights. Depriving police of their rights to form unions or to bargain collectively will not necessarily make them more accountable or their discipline policies more transparent. Elected officials have the power and the responsibility to ensure that collective bargaining contracts do not insulate police or any public employees from accountability to the citizens who they serve. Nevertheless, I think there are a number of really specific ways in which we can look at reform. Professor Fisk has written in detail about this, so I assume that she'll cover some of these, but I think a number of categories of reform that I think that we can look at that can increase accountability for police abuse without threatening the rights of police and other workers to collective bargaining. Most of these involve protections that are common in police contracts, but are rarely extended to other workers, such as allowing police to view evidence against them in abuse complaints before they testify, limiting public access to discipline records, or destroying records after a specific period of time. Other reforms focus on functions that distinguish police from other workers, particularly the use of force and the wielding of lethal power. These include heightened standards for investigations of killings by police, consideration of patterns of complaint in disciplined cases, and public access to records of discipline and complaint. Finally, I think a number of reforms should be considered to the collective bargaining process itself, including changing the definition of collective bargaining units, the role of minority representation in the bargaining process, and public notice of the schedule and issues involved in bargaining. And this is something that, again, that DeRay touched on in sort of giving the public more access to the collective bargaining process. So thanks again for including me in this conversation, and I look forward to it continuing.
Perfect, thank you so much. Professor Fisk?
Thank you very much. I am in awe of Mr. McKesson, I must say, and the organizations that you have founded and work with. The work that I've done learning about police unions simply would not have been possible without your really extraordinary work. And I think that um, as Professor Jones pointed out, I have been looking at police unions, recognizing that police are workers too. They unionized in the 20th century for the same reason that all workers have unionized. In part, it was poor pay and working conditions. In the early 20th century, during the recession, the depression of the 1930s, there were cities that didn't pay any of their public employees for months or years at a time, teachers and police officers alike. And the public is not served by having a police force that depends on bribes to feed their families. And so if we're going to have police, and I think that I'm grateful for the activists who are promoting discussion of civilianization of massive amounts of work that is currently done by armed police officers. But whoever is working for the public need to have job protections that protect their interests as workers, but that at the same time recognize that they are performing a public service. And so as we talk about big picture issues like should police have the right to unionize, if you substitute from that sentence, should teachers have the right to unionize, or nurses, or firefighters, or DMV clerks, it's important to recognize that we have to balance those competing interests. So as was mentioned, I have been working on developing a set of proposals that are focused primarily on the distinct situation of police officers in California. And I want to say that I personally agree with the 6 things that Nix the Six is proposing. I think they're exactly right. But to put a little more specifics in what I and my collaborators think might make a difference, I think increasing transparency in contract negotiation, in record keeping, and in the administration of police labor relations are a good thing. So I think there should be public access to negotiations over police contracts. Of course, public access will only work if there are community organizations that are doing the work that Mr. McKesson and his colleagues are doing. Because often, if you go to public meetings of various city agencies or city councils, there's nobody there except for the special groups whose economic interests are most directly impacted. And the public is only going to get the quality of governance that the public is prepared to hold city leaders to account for. So organizing is absolutely crucial, and I'm grateful for those who are doing it. One of the things we know, for example, that teachers have done fairly successfully, but only fairly recently, is mobilize the public on their side in contract negotiations. They have done that by aligning teacher interests with the interests of students and families and the communities. The teachers call this bargaining for the common good. And I think what we're essentially looking to in the police context is for the public to force management, if the police unions aren't willing, but to force management to adopt some of the strategies of bargaining for the common good, and to recognize that the public has a profound interest in how policing is done, even though in most states, the way that police go about doing their jobs, or whether we treat interactions with the homeless people as a civilian function, a mental health function, or a function that the police form, that is something that the public cares deeply about and the public should be involved with. I think it's important for transparency to work, that it happen early in the process. So in many jurisdictions, California is among them, I believe, although again, Mr. McKesson knows a lot more detail about this nationwide than I do. But my sense is that in many jurisdictions, contract proposals only become public at the end of the negotiation process, where the city, for example, has to hold a public hearing before the city council ratifies a contract. That is too late, because by that point it is a done deal, and it's very hard to then undo a contract once it's already been negotiated. The transparency has to happen at the beginning. The city has to have public hearings on what its contract proposals will be before it goes in to negotiate them, so that there can be feedback, and so that the public can then make sure that when the contract is done, it is done in a way that serves the interest of the community, not just the interest of the city, for example, that has a financial interest often in trading off greater job protections for officers in exchange for holding the line on salaries, health benefits, retirement benefits, because elected leaders often think in the short term about budget. They don't think in the longer term about if you keep officers on the force, the small minority of officers who are the ones who are responsible for the majority of civil rights judgments following the murder of members of the public by police officers, the city is essentially shifting money from salaries and benefits to paying judgments, which is a terrible way for the city to budget. And as we know, because of the work of activists, there are many cities that have massive debt from having had to borrow money to pay judgments to the survivors of people who have been injured, maimed, or murdered by police violence. We need to be spending the money getting those provisions out of contracts or out of statutes early in the process. And of course, as Campaign Zero and now Nix the Six have been arguing, we need much more transparency, not only about the content of contracts, and I'm grateful to them for having made that information public, but also about disciplinary records. In California, legislation passed in 2019 to increase the transparency of officer complaint and disciplinary records, but more should be done. In California, the law only grants public access to 3 categories of records involving shootings or the use of force causing serious injury or death, sustained findings of a law enforcement officer committing a sexual assault, not those that are still in process or that were not sustained because of the way that the evidence was perhaps in equipoise and therefore it wasn't sustained. And the third category is sustained findings of dishonesty by an officer that impacted the reporting, investigation, or prosecution of a crime. This is too narrow. We need much more public information. We need, for that information to be public, we need transparency of all law enforcement disciplinary records, whether it is done through the collective bargaining process or, as in California and some other states, it could also go through the civil service process. Police officers in many states are civil service jobs, which is intended to keep them from being corrupted by the political system, where a new DA is elected and gets rid of all the old people and brings in political cronies. That doesn't serve the public interest, so it makes sense that they be civil service jobs, but we need much more transparency. I believe that all arbitration decisions involving public employees are matters of the public interest and should be available to the public. And that includes for police officers. And one could deal with the privacy interests of complainants, victims, witnesses, through more narrow protections when there is a reason to keep those identities private. There are a lot of specific things that we could do in the way that civil service appeals and arbitrators deal with police discipline. But I think, and I don't want to get into the weeds because it would bore you to death about standards of evidence in arbitration and in civil service appeals. But the point is to make sure that the people who decide those matters remember the public interest, not just the interest of the city or the interest of the officer, to sort of make the public interest paramount. And there are a variety of ways we could change the rules of evidence, the rules for findings in those kinds of proceedings. And finally, I think it's important to have accountability in collective representation. Police unions tend not to be accountable to those members of the police department who, for example, identify as members of the communities that are simultaneously over-policed through abusive practices and yet under-protected against the kinds of property crimes or other violent crimes that we need to do something about. Bracketing for the moment the question about how to use or if we should use police to deal with property crimes and crimes against people, I think that police unions are over responsive to the sort of fear of arbitrary discipline. When the US Justice Department went into Baltimore to look at what was going on in the Baltimore Police Department in the wake of the murder of Freddie Gray, one of the things they found when they interviewed rank and file officers was a concern about arbitrariness in discipline. You would get disciplined as a cop if it was publicly revealed that you had abused somebody, but you wouldn't get disciplined if it wasn't publicly revealed. Now, Mr. McKesson, I believe, is a resident of Baltimore and knows more about this than I do, and what the Justice Department reported may not be accurate. But if that is true, that kind of arbitrariness in supervision and discipline is the thing that feeds police unions to be over-responsive to the concerns of officers who are accused of misconduct and undervalue the concerns of the communities of color, especially Black and Brown communities, who have members of their community who are on the force in many places. And those minorities, I mean, both racial and numerical minorities in many police departments, go into policing because they want to help the community, and then the union is not responsive to their interests. So I think there are ways we could reform police union governance to improve their accountability by empowering minority organizations within police departments. I want to just sum up by saying, I think just eliminating job protections or union rights puts a great deal of faith in management to be benevolent, wise, and always correct. And I admire, of course, those police chiefs and senior officers in police departments who are, but I'm not sure that that is a universal phenomenon. And the concentration of power in any set of hands is generally not a good idea. So I'm hopeful that we can improve the governance of police departments and police unions especially. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Fisk. I think you ended with a good segue talking about both the role of management and the directors of these departments. It occurs to me that I don't think that I know very many police chiefs who are also a PhD. So I don't know whether to call you Dr. Chief Brackney, Chief Dr. Brackney, Dr. Brackney, Chief Brackney. I'll probably use all four, but please, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
You know what? I tell people all the time where it has the most influence. In academe, often doctor sits well. In police context, chief, because the authority and expertise that they seem to bring with it. But thank you to Harvard. It's amazing that you're having an entire series and you're not just doing a one-off. This is an esteemed panel, and there's a lot to unpack from all of the previous speakers. But the first thing I want to say is we think about this as a person who has been in every position represented by unions, part of the labor management team, and then who have also studied procedural justice in policing and how you get that into the community. The first thing I think is important is to understand that police unions have long been a divisive union in America from the very beginning, and it's based on its genealogy of how it arrived at the space that it currently sits in. It had very different origins in the South. And very different origins in the North. And what's interesting about it, first, if I talk about the North portion of how policing were formed and the need for unions, police were originally used in the North to suppress union activity, to suppress strikes. And in Cleveland, the strikes that occurred in like the early 18 or mid 1800s and things of that nature, police officers killed union workers and striking individuals. So they were being leveraged in very different ways. In the South, the police and then the forming of policing were based in slave patrols and enforcing that again, that there were not resurrections, one, on the plantations, but also two, enforcing the rules around when a enslaved laborer was moving off of their owner's plantations, right? Checking for papers and things of that nature. So police unions have always had a controversial history and a divisive one. They weren't originally built on the same types of protections in some ways that other unions. Yes, there were low wages. You're right, Dr. Fisk, that their officers were not being paid. They also had to pay for their uniforms and those other things. So they really came around bargaining around work conditions, much like other places. But they've expanded far beyond what other labor unions have been able to negotiate and bargain for. And what we've seen, their increased protections have led to decreased protections in the communities that they actually now serve. So the more layers of insulation that they have through government and through the criminal legal system have caused us to see a direct correlation between those protections and abuses in the communities that they serve, particularly around excessive force to in Black and Brown communities who don't have the same types of protections. What the police have been able to fall under the umbrellas of are governmental protections like qualified immunity, which were not originally part of their contracts and negotiations. That was originally so that you could not sue your government personally for the decisions and the way that they were governing. And we now fall under those umbrellas in which the unions now continue to negotiate for those type of protections that would not necessarily apply for other labor unions. When I talk about what they now are governing or negotiating beyond is disciplinary records. There are not, there's no other agency I know that bargains for discipline matrices as to one, who gets into the system and then how you're treated once you are in that system. I can't imagine that the SEIU unions have that same kind of power. I can't imagine that, you know, the AFL-CIO have that same kind of power. Now, what's so interesting about all of this is how the unions particularly have moved from protections for their employees to being lobbyists and activists in the same kind of way private industry has lobbied our legislators to get the type of conditions, whether it's around production and steel, environment, etc. What you have to realize is that these police unions or police benevolence associations, which are just as powerful as these unions and they fly under the radar, they represent close to 800,000 individuals across the nation. Those are the sworn individuals. They not necessarily all of the supporting entities that also work within police agencies, sheriff's departments, which we often forget about because we only think of the single elected person that lead the sheriff's department and not the other employees that may fall underneath it. And that means their influence, their local, their state, their regional and national influence is far reaching. And when I say that it is far reaching, we now know that our unions are negotiating directly with the political entities that they are now endorsing. Which makes this really strange bedfellows. So you often have these politicians who are willing to give concessions in order to get endorsements. And that is not like most unions where there is a direct effect, right, between the mayor or the city manager who are negotiating on behalf of the city and the constituents and the communities they represent, and those workers or employers who will then carry out their duties and responsibilities. The one thing I say we don't hit on often enough is that union negotiations do not occur in a vacuum. And everyone hit on that point. Dr. Jones, Dr. Fisk, and D. Ray McKesson hit on those points, is that someone signs those contracts. Someone says, I am willing to allow this police department to police this community under these conditions, and I will sign off on that contract so that we don't hold the elected officials to the same standard that which then the police unions were able to successfully negotiate for. Very few entities, and I think D-Ray mentioned one, in which they refuse to sign off on the contract. They all sign off. And they don't even sign off as a dissenting opinion to the contract. They sign off saying, we are in agreement with the conditions in this contract in which we will allow our police to then police within the communities. What we have seen study after study is once these contracts are put into place, there is a culture or there is an attitude that occurs within these agencies of immunity, and that they can operate with impunity at the exact same time. And that is a dangerous culture in which a person can leverage the kind of power that they have and do that with absolute immunity. There are little to no police convictions and police shootings. Um, Even within the disciplinary realms, I think there was a study in Chicago where they submitted 2,400 complaints and maybe 12 of them were sustained. It might have been even Milwaukee. I don't want to get the facts wrong there. And even the sustained complaint, the most severe discipline was 4 hours of suspended time. So, can you imagine when you have that kind of qualified immunity, not just protections from the government itself, but within a local agency? And what does that mean for the organizations? The FOPs nationally have been able to create not only allies, but alliances. Individuals who've been able to trade in um, their resources on behalf of law enforcement. Every politician runs on a law and order campaign. However, they fail to define what does that law and order campaign look like versus a public safety campaign. And when you speak on a law and order campaign, you speak to the cultural narrative of police officers who then no longer have to make the distinctions of what does procedural justice look like in a community? What does equitable policing look like in a community? I can now laser focus all of my attention on those communities that I may not have any affinity towards or with. Add on to the power of the unions, you have to look at the composition of the workers in which they represent. Of the 800,000 policing entity or persons in policing, with the more than 18,000 policing agencies across the nation, 80% are white males. 80% are white males. You have 12% that are female and 3% that are African American. So when you have someone like myself who sits in this position, the likelihood that you will have a person of color whose lived experiences have come from the same communities that are over policed and underprotected, and that voice is added to those negotiations often goes unheard. When you talk about transparency in the negotiations are done in absolute secret. And the reason that they're done in absolute secret is not just because of the union and the protections they're looking for, but the politicians who are negotiating these contracts on their behalf. You have to do these in secret because then you're held to a standard of accountability. Am I in agreement with it? Just the opposite. I am completely in disagreement with how unions now currently operate and the power that they have. The good thing is, the good news, and I know you probably have tons of questions that people are waiting to get to. The good news is there is now a reckoning in the police profession and a reckoning with these unions. And not only is there a reckoning, there's a call to rectify, to correct the wrongs that have been built into these contracts, that have been built into the way we police, and have been built into a government that has been that was founded on a gentried white male patriarchal society. So I am sure your students in your audience have a ton of questions. So I will wrap this up so we can get to the meat of these discussions.
Dr. Brackney, everyone, thank you so much. I think we have gotten to the meat, but there has been a lot already shared. And as we said at the outset, what we want to do now is come back through the panel. So much has been said to give each of you a chance to either respond to what some of the other panelists have said or share additional thoughts or engage in conversations with each other. I want to frame, especially for our students, this is, this is a lot, there are a lot of moving parts to this story. And we have, so really the national experts thinking about this question. And I want to suggest a theme or a narrative that is running through this conversation just as a way of opening things up and maybe giving our students some ways of organizing this information. So first, as Professor Fisk said, police are workers too. It is why we are having this conversation. They are public sector workers, like teachers, like firefighters. And so they engage and trigger our concerns about working people and about unions. But at the same time, the job of policing and the history of policing, particularly as Dr. Brackney articulated, is different and it is unique. And I just want to air out, so I teach criminal law and criminal procedure. And so I want to remind our students what we mean when we talk about the power of police in the criminal system. And I think we have all, we have learned so much around this conversation about police use of force, and especially the disproportionate and excessive use of force against African Americans. And that is front and center for so many of us when we think about what's our paradigmatic image of a police abuse, and then how might this conversation around the profession of police and the political role of police address that. And I just want to fill that concern out a little more. I think there are a few more things we should be worried about. Police are uniquely authorized to use force. We authorize the military to use force, and they don't have unions. So they are unique in that sense, but they are more broadly unique in their power to criminalize. I do a lot of work in lower courts and around low-level offenses and order maintenance and misdemeanors. And I just want to remind our students that the power to criminalize is also a coercive and powerful governmental authority, the power to arrest, to mark a person with a record, to put them in jail, to upend their life, to upend their employment prospects just through the exercise of discretion. And I want to tie that back into our conversation about police professions, because as we've seen now in a series of lawsuits, particularly in New York, but also this conversation about police professionalism as part of police promotions and rewards. We know that there are both formal and informal arrest quotas, that police may be under pressure to criminalize people as part of their own professional advancement. We saw, of course, in Ferguson that police were under pressure to raise money for the city. So there are all kinds of features of police authority, from the power to criminalize and arrest and impose the prospect of fines and fees and burdens all the way up through the power to use force, excessive force, and even deadly force. And all of that is impacted by the relationship between police forces and their own unions. And it is also that power to criminalize, again, as many of you have mentioned, that in many ways gives police so much of their political authority, that the intersection of criminalization and the deployment of that kind of fear in our history of the racialization of crime intersects with American politics in a particularly caustic way. So all of our amazing panelists have told us this rich narrative about this enormous world of in which our criminal system is interacting with our political system. So let me now throw it back to our panel. We'll start again, please, with DeRay, and just anything you want to add or respond to or share in this conversation.
No, this is it's always great to be around people who believe in this. I remember when we did in 2015, people thought we were silly and this was wonky. And like when we, it took us a year to get the 80 contracts that we had and we coded them, and people were like, that's so cute, so now it's like great that everybody, like people are focused on it. I will say for the academic crowd and for students, one of the biggest barriers that we find in cities is that the police come really prepared. They're just like, whether it's true or not true, they walk in the room being like, if this happens, so in Maryland, their big thing, and I literally just had a call with somebody in the state Senate about it yesterday. What they're saying, the way that they're trying to like not get the law enforcement officer Bill of Rights repealed, like their last stand is to say that if we repeal the law enforcement officer Bill of Rights, it'll lead to 140 separate systems of discipline. So now people are freaked out because they're like, well, the Bill of Rights is bad, but we don't want 140 systems that are all different in jurisdictions. And you're like, well, that's not, there are states that don't have Bill of Rights and they have different systems and they were, but the fear of like, the police just do the fear part really well. And it'd be helpful to have people like you all in the room, like academics or people to just say, hey, like this. The other thing we find is like the single biggest thing, like this is probably the biggest thing, is due process. The police will just start saying it. They're like, you're taking away my due process rights. We're like, I think we're saying that you can't like, lie about this thing. And they're like, due process. And we're like, well, I think we're saying that you can't beat that person. They're like, due process. And it just literally everything becomes due process. And the legislators don't really understand what due process is. So the police say it enough, and you line up 5 police chiefs and a state's attorney saying that this is violating their due process, and the legislators feel boxed in. So I'd say that like one of the things that could help us out a lot would be providing cover for those, because that's what we see in actual communities. Like they're not really fighting about, like in a lot of theoretical circles, I see people worried about the impact on other unions and stuff like I'm not actually seeing that play out in cities. I'm seeing this like due process thing or like some of the fear mongering happening. And the only other thing that somebody made me think of is that part of our work is to focus on, and Professor Fisk, I think it was your comment, is like part of our work is to focus on the issues wherever they manifest, not only the contracts, right? So Denver, Boston, and Atlanta are really good examples of like either no contract or the contract's like boilerplate labor, right? Like who cares? But the city policy has all of the things that would normally be in a contract, and it's awful. So Denver rehires a huge number of officers a year who they fire, not the contract. The contract is like it doesn't matter in Denver. It's all these policies and internal things in the city that are completely up to the control of the mayor. And trying to figure out how do we also create these pressure points so people in those places don't feel like there's nothing to do. There's a ton to do. It just isn't actually the collective bargaining agreement. And the last thing is that I think what we've seen in organizing around it is that people are just afraid. Legislators get afraid. Like at the end of the day, when it comes down to like the actual vote, or they're like, I know this is crazy, but the police said everybody will die if and you're like, okay. And that's what we actually like fight up against often.
You know what, D-Ray, I love that. You're exactly right. Talking about being prepared, I say this all the time, regardless of your politics and your appreciation for politics, which is a lot of the conversations and the narratives that we spin. It's not whether it's reality or not, it's the same consistent message over and over and over again, so that we start reciting it as part of the public as being the exact truth and narrative, right? Police officers will get no less due process than any other employee of any other business or any other government entity. The interesting thing about it is we do a lot of things extremely well. We market and brand well. We stay on message. We do not go off of message, no matter what occurs. If you ask, just as D-Ray said, if you talk about what does repealing the Bill of Rights look like, right? You still have a contract or even a city policy that talks about what your due process is for any other employee who may be facing an allegation of theft or abuse within their positions. But you're right, we come extremely prepared. And then the other thing that we do extremely well, where we could use your students and even this panel, is we never bring experts to rebut, ever. It is always, I almost think of this as a grand jury process, that you only get one side of the story in a grand jury, right? And no one gets to defend it. It is the prosecutor's side of the story, bringing in all of their witnesses, bringing in all of their evidence, and then you have no choice but to do whatever, fail to indict or to indict or to bring a true bill out at the end of that. So where you could leverage your student body is bringing those expertise into rebut. And very seldom does the city come prepared, because they want to use their general pool of attorneys. They don't bring in labor contract experts. They don't hire anyone else. They go, if they do, on low bid. So they're almost always going to need expertise that doesn't cost them, because they can't afford costly negotiations. Where the unions have not only unlimited offensive supply of money, the cities often have to contribute to the union's pool of money for defense, and even for the union to exist. So it's interesting that the cities have to pay into the unions as well as the members pay into them as well, which give them a lot more unlimited cash than the local organization who they're negotiating against.
Professor Jones, did you want to jump in
Yeah,
here?
I just want to, I wanted to point or pick up on this theme about the history of policing, and that both Dr. Brackney brought up and Professor Natapoff. I think the sort of the origins of policing in labor control, which is true of both the examples that Dr. Brackney cited of that slave patrols were engaged in labor patrol or labor control, and in the North, the use of police to break strikes and to break up unions is a really, I think, important part of what the origins of policing are. It also points to the sort of the authority that Professor Natapoff pointed to, that early policing was premised on the idea that courts were very weak and had limited reach. Communication and transportation was very slow, so police were actually explicitly given authority to use violence and to judge people, right? The sort of implicit in the authority to arrest was the authority to judge, in a way that I think we often forget. So I think that's a really important part of the history. I think another part, and Dr. Brackney pointed to this, is the sort of paradoxical fact that police have also, in their union rights, been sort of emblematic of the challenges faced by public employees in general. So if we go back to the Boston police strike in 1919, which was really about the rights of public employees to affiliate with the broader union movement. And that, for almost the entire 20th century, was cited as an example of why no public employees should be allowed to form unions, because it sort of divided their loyalty and pitted them against the interests of the public. So I think in some ways we need to think about sort of broadly of police as holding this paradoxical position of being sort of in their jobs actually being controlling working class people, right? And disciplining working class communities, but then also being emblematic of the sort of difficulties and challenges that are faced by the broader union movement in justifying the rights to collective bargaining and the rights to organization, the political power of unions. The question of policing, I think, really brings both of those things into focus.
Professor Fisk, do you want to weigh in?
I spoke for a long time in the opening statement. I would love to let questions be answered if there are questions.
And I want to turn it back to Dr. Brackney just to make sure that we've given everyone a chance to respond to each other.
Oh, I broke ranks. I forgot we were going in a certain order.
There are no ranks.
Darn it. There you go with these darn unions and the influence, right? Just jumped on in there. You know I'm good. Again, if we just want to keep building on the conversation, I echo Dr. Fisk.
Do you mind if I ask just a kind of clarifying question on this theme that Professor Natapoff has put out? Because as I basically heard it, it's this question of, are the police representative, right? You know, police are workers too, or as Professor Fisk put it, you know, the police officer and the teacher alike, kind of, you know, the emblematic, to use Professor Jones's word, of workers and of public workers, or are they entirely exceptional and unique, and you can't really compare them to anything because they're the only public servants who can kill people lawfully, right? I guess a question I have when we are thinking of the police in the context of the broader labor movement is the worry when we sort of emphasize and underscore police are workers too, that we're worried about the police officers as workers, or that we are worried that efforts to undermine the police officers as workers will undermine the teacher as a worker? In other words, is the concern a kind of labor-oriented concern for the police officer, or is it a worry, and I guess maybe I'm asking which is the primary worry, you know, is the big worry that if we, you know, go to the extreme and, you know, try to get rid of all collective bargaining for police officers, that we're worried about what that does to the officer, or we're worried that they're coming for the teacher next? And I'm curious which you think is driving the concern for different folks in this argument.
I can jump in on that. I think it's both, and I think it may depend on the circumstances. In California, I believe somebody from the CCPOA, the California Correctional and Peace Officers Association, has said flat out, if you come for us, we are taking teachers and nurses down with us. So I do sometimes hear the same criticism of police unionization per se and teacher unionization per se. They exercise really important public functions. They have been unaccountable to the needs of the community, and therefore, you know, they have too much political clout. Therefore, we need to ban them, full stop. We need to restrict their ability to make political contributions, etc. But I also think that at the more fine-grained level, that sometimes what leads to police abuses are management, what I would regard as bad management processes. So there was a case involving a shooting in a New York apartment building a few years ago, where they trained rookies by sending them in to conduct what they called so-called vertical patrols. You take a rookie and you put him in the stairwell of a building, having told the rookie that there are drug dealers, armed drug dealers in the stairwell. And the rookie panicked and shot somebody who was a perfectly, I mean, it doesn't really matter who they shot somebody. And so that is a stupid way, in my judgment. I'm not a police officer, and I would defer to Chief Captain Professor Dr. Brackney on this. That just strikes me as a stupid way to train a rookie. Or if you look at the murder of George Floyd, two of the officers that were there that were bystanders were rookies in their first weeks on the job. You know, why on earth was the department having the officer who killed Mr. Floyd training rookies? You know, there are reasons for that, but that strikes me as we do need to think about officers as employees who are concerned about quotas for arrests that leads to the massive criminalization of communities in the way that Professor Natapoff described, bad training that leads people to shoot first, and that those are job issues that it leads me to understand why then the rookie who gets fired and prosecuted for murder in a circumstance like the killing of George Floyd, you know, maybe in fact they do deserve to be prosecuted for murder. I'm not expressing a view on that, but I am saying that I understand then why that makes a lot of junior officers quite paranoid about their vulnerability to being made an example of in a circumstance that should have been prevented.
We have a question from one of our audience participants. This is from Peter Musante, who asks for views on whether nationalizing this sort of effort is helpful or hurtful. You know, I could imagine it potentially going in multiple directions, right? On the one hand, you know, we've talked about, you know, Professor Natapoff says that one theme is police are workers too. I think another theme of the conversation is maybe that management are politicians too, right? That this is an area where on the management side, political forces are a huge part of this. And so maybe you could imagine, oh, look, move the decision away from the city council, move it up to national level, and you won't have that, you know, the local union won't have as much force. On the flip side, nationalizing it seems potentially, you know, there's some powerful forces there too, including at one of the presidential debates, if I remember correctly, the defeated candidate telling the other candidate, no one's backing you from law enforcement. You don't have name a single union that's backing you, name a single. So does it help or hurt to move the conversation to that level and to try to do this with national standards and things like that?
You know, I think that one factor that I would add to this is that, I mean, we can talk about the sort of nationalization of policing, but there's also the question of the nationalization of labor rights. And one of the reasons that we're having this conversation is that when the federal government passed a law that still is in effect, giving all workers the right to join unions, to bargain collectively, and to go on strike, public employees were excluded from that law. And the principal reason they were excluded was the lesson that people thought they learned from the Boston police strike in 1919, which is that if you give public employees the right to join unions, they will go on strike and they will deprive the public of public services. And that was applied not just to police, but it was applied to teachers and garbage collectors and anybody who worked for a government. And because of that, it was actually, that created a very unworkable situation that states passed laws in the 1960s and 70s to essentially accommodate for this strange system. And so now we have a system that's very local. There was actually an effort to pass federal standards for collective bargaining for public employees that was overwhelmingly supported in the Democratic House last year. And the week that Breonna Taylor was killed, a number of Democrats withdrew their support from it because they said, how is this going to empower police officers? How is this going to allow police, you know, sort of extend the power of police unions? So again, I think we find ourselves in this situation that, and I think this actually gets back to the point that Professor Crespo started this conversation with, which is, you know, is this a problem? Is this a problem of the nature of policing? Is it a problem of collective bargaining? And I think it's actually both and I think it points to the real need to address this problem that I think we've sort of in some ways sort of punted to the state level and to the local level. So I would say yes, I think we do need to address this at the at the federal level, but it can't be addressed simply by looking at the nature of policing. It also we have to look at police as workers and what their rights are on the job. And whether there's, I think with public employees, this is a question of, we ask public employees to make decisions that are very critical to our lives, right? So teachers need the power to be able to make decisions about curriculum or about discipline in their classrooms. And in order to do that, they need some rights on the job. And I think, police also need those rights within the context of doing their job as the way we define it. And so I do think that we need to set national standards.
I'll just add to that it's this conversation about national or local is mirrored in our conversations about criminal law reform itself. Our criminal system is a profoundly local system. The federal criminal system is, less than 5% of our criminal system. Mostly for the history of this country has been one of devolving. I shouldn't even say devolving, leaving criminal system authority in the hands of localities, and it percolates up, not down. The reason we have all these thousands of police departments, thousands also of prosecutorial offices, every state, county, and municipality in many cities are making these decisions on their own. So it is a structurally local phenomenon in which police have always been sitting there at the base of that pyramid, at base of that foundation. So that's very hard to change. It's connected to local law enforcement authority, local authority to create criminal law itself. I'm wondering if I could pull a professorial trick, which is to redirect Professor Crespo's question back, DeRay, to you. Just because I'm dying of curiosity to hear what you say. So you opened your remarks by saying something approximately that the police unions sit outside the labor movement. They sit outside other unions. And I think that really resonates with Professor Crespo's question about to what extent are they different or what extent are they the same? And I just wonder if you could expand on what you meant when you said that they sit outside.
Yeah, I think it's an open question of like whether they're workers or not. That's not like the place that I fight my battle, but I'm always interested when people, we don't let the Army unionize for a reason. That is convincing to me. The police in a lot of neighborhoods feel like the Army. So I don't even think that's like a long leap, feels like a short skip to me. But I don't, we're in conversation with a lot of labor people about this too. I don't think it's weird to be like, they operate differently than everybody else. I don't know why, I'm in a lot of theoretical conversations where people are like freaked out that if we do this thing, the police and suddenly we're gonna demolish teachers unions. It's like people have been attacking teachers unions forever without us doing anything to the police. They don't need a push. They don't need a gust of wind. They've been doing it, and I came from the teacher union world. That was the world I came up in. And that's actually why we started our project, because I used to manage all the labor agreements in Minneapolis and in Baltimore. So I knew all this stuff that were in teachers' contracts that nobody else would have known if I didn't have to administer them. And we on a hunch were like, are there things in police union contracts? And then we were like, there are. That's how we even got here. So I don't know. I just I think it is not even a wild statement to be like the protections that police have are unlike anybody else. That's not, if we map, I don't know another public sector or private sector union where we destroy the disciplinary records after 1 year. I don't know, show me that. If we did that with teachers, it would be, we burned down a school system. If it was one, you think about cheating scandals. It takes one school where there might have been cheating. We'd have fired the superintendent. We might close the whole school. We might zero-base the team. I mean, we have for all the fuss that people say about teachers unions, they have no power compared to the police. It's I don't know why it always feels like a bizarre thing where you're like, yeah, I don't think that they're the same. You're like, no, and they can kill people. The teachers at worst are annoying. You know what I mean? That is the worst of the teachers unions. They're just annoying. Or they are loud at a school board meeting or something. That's literally the worst thing that comes out of the teachers union. The worst of policing is they kill people. And it's it feels weird that we even allow the conversation that they are similar. feels really weird. So like that bill that you were talking about, Professor Jones, we actually, I can't even remember his name. We have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to get Dems off the bill because it was an SEIU bill. So like people didn't even know it included the police because it was EMTs in the police. So like people just like supported it because it was public sector bargaining. And I did this interview on Bill Simmons' podcast actually about it, about a lot of things, but one of them was that. And the sponsor of the bill, whose name I cannot remember, he called me. He was like, Dre, all these people heard you on the pod and they got to me. Can we talk about it? And I'm like, yeah, the bill's this is bad. This is not a good version of this. And he was like, well, we'll pull it. And I was like, that's great. Thank you. Please pull it. And like, you know, we worked really hard to like get to him and get to some other people. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, when we think of the national conversation, I honestly think that like the legislators don't know enough about the police. I trust the local people a little more than I trust the national people to crank out good legislation that might help us. I'd be interested to see if we can nationally change the power of arbitrators through like the federal arbitration rules, or like that to me seems like a site for the federal government to do something. Otherwise, or on the union piece, I just get nervous that they're going to screw it up and that we won't be able to get a big win. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to Virginia. Virginia just passed a law that will allow all the police departments to unionize coming up. And like, we're freaked out about that. That is not that's a bad thing, you know?
Dr. Brackney, were you trying to get in?
Yeah, but there's also something we might want to consider. You may want to consider just national conditions under which you can even create a police department, right? So that might get you there to start. If you decide you want a police department, you can just kind of add water, create with no standards for what that looks like. So that gets you, I think, in some ways to where you want to be. And then you have to maintain these national standards to stay as a police department. So that then cuts around the unions, and it creates these entities, right? We have standards under which you can create a hospital, and there's standards that you must meet to be able to do that. We have standards for schools, as D-Ray was just saying, to create a school which are held to National Department of Education standards that you must reach in order for that school to stay in existence. I mean, you can't have a 0% proficiency rate in science, and then they say, oh, you know what, keep going. In a school system or a school district, there are federal standards to very localized unions, behaviors, and the way public servants are out there in the world. What's so interesting is that there are other unions calling for the expulsion of the International Union of Police Associations, right? Because that the conditions in which they're bargaining for are actually hurting other unions and other agencies. And so you want to look at it. What are those resolutions? I mean, the Association of Flight Attendants adopted a resolution demanding that the law enforcement, you know, acknowledge racism, acknowledge their supremacy, acknowledge these other things. So there are other unions now trying to hold police unions accountable because of the toxic way in which these unions have created these environments in which police can operate with impunity.
The only thing I'd say to that is that I worry about, you know, because when we launched this, people were like, why aren't you doubling down on getting the police unions kicked out of larger unions? And we're like, we're not, we think that's a good strategy. We also know that all of the big unions could kick the police out and it won't change their power, right? Like it won't. And frankly, the FOP is worse than all of them. So them going to the FOP is probably not a great, like, that's probably not a great thing either, right? So when we say things like that the bigger unions are trying to rein in their power, like, I don't know if putting out a statement is reining in their power, right? Like it'd be cool to have the SEIU say, like, we won't support you if you don't take these things. I don't know, like, it feels like there must be more they can actually do while they're still under that umbrella. Because just not being covered by the big unions won't actually, like, it won't change any of the contracts, won't diminish their power, won't change their right to bargain. And the only place they'll have to go when they leave these will be the actual FOP, which is, you know, truly the least helpful of all the people I've ever been in a room with around police stuff.
We are So sadly out of time. I'll just say thank you to all of our extraordinary panelists. The recorded version of this wonderful conversation will soon be available publicly, so we can share it with others who weren't able to listen to it live. Thank you again. I'll turn it over to my co-host, Professor Crespo, to say goodbye. But let me just express our gratitude to all of you for taking the time out.
This has just been such a terrific panel, and I'm so grateful to all of you. I mean, one of the privileges of co-hosting this with Professor Natapoff all year is how much we are learning from this. And it strikes me in listening to you all talk that, you know, in some ways this conversation for the past hour and a half has been, who are the police? I mean, like, who are the police? You know, are they workers? Are they the military? Are they emblematic? Are they exceptional? Are they representative? Are they entirely unique? And you've given us so much to think about with that, and I'm so grateful. To everyone watching, we have a whole another semester worth of this series to come. Our website, policingamerica.law.harvard.edu, can let you know what the future panels subject matter will be, the months that we have set out for them, the dates as they go up. But I just want to end one more time by thanking all four of you, and of course, Professor Natapoff as well. And we're so appreciative to you for sharing these insights.